Hi guys! Thank you so much for clicking on today's video. In this video we're going to be talking about Albert Fish, which is quite possibly one of the most disturbing cases ever. This case is quite famous in the USA, but definitely not as well known as it should be, and this is probably due to how old it is. But despite this, there's still a lot of information available, which I found extremely interesting, so hopefully you do too. As always, this video was recorded live over on Twitch, and you can find the links for my channel on screen now, or in the description box down below. And if you like this style of content, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube. Your support really means a lot in helping my channel to grow. Before we get into today's video, I just want to give a huge trigger warning and disclaimer. This is a very difficult case to get through, with a lot of distressing topics. These topics include abuse of children, SA, mental illness, inflicting harm on oneself, and cannibalism. There may be other trigger warnings that I am missing, so viewer discretion is definitely advised for this case. If you don't think that today's case is suitable for you, please feel free to click off the video. I completely understand, and you are welcome to come back when we're talking about a topic which you think is more suitable for you. I also want to mention that all of the information we'll be talking about today has come from research which I have conducted through sources which are readily available on the internet. No disrespect is intended with this presentation in any way. The intention of this video is for educational purposes only. I do try my hardest to get all of the information I include correct to the best of my ability. I do apologise if there's any mistakes at all. This is especially relevant in this case due to how old it is, as there's quite a lot of conflicting sources, so please keep this in mind throughout. Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C. on the 19th of May, 1870, so this is a really old one. He was originally named Hamilton Howard Fish by his parents Randall Fish and Ellen Frances Howell, but I'm going to refer to him as Albert throughout the whole case just to make sure it's not too confusing. His father was an American but from English descent, and his mother was Scots-Irish American. At the time of Albert's birth, his father was 75 years old, which was 43 years older than his mother, who was aged 32 at the time. Albert was the youngest of his siblings, with two brothers named Walter and Edwin, and a sister named Annie. There were also several other siblings who had sadly passed away, which was something that was quite common for this time. And I wasn't able to find much information on those children, including how many of them there was in total, so I'm sorry for that missing information, but there on screen you can see a picture of Albert Fish when he was a young boy. Albert's family was said to have a long history of mental health issues. His uncle was diagnosed with mania, which is described as someone who has sustained periods of abnormally high or erratic moods, which is coupled with intense energy bursts. This is a mental illness which is still diagnosed today, but it's also commonly diagnosed alongside bipolar disorder, which is something I saw in online sources. One of Albert's half-brothers suffered with schizophrenia, and his sister was also diagnosed with what was reported as a mental affliction, which through research I found could have been a number of different mental illnesses by today's standards, but I'm unsure of which exactly they are. His mother was also reported to have been suffering from oral and visual hallucinations too. So this family was suffering with a long history of very different mental illnesses, which is something you might want to just keep in the back of your mind as we go through this case. Following his father's death in 1975 from a heart attack, aged 80, 5-year-old Albert and his siblings were abandoned at St. John's Orphanage in Washington by his mother, and this was because she didn't have the finances to look after the kids at this time. Within the orphanage, Albert, who was named Hamilton at this time, was relentlessly bullied and nicknamed Ham and Eggs by the kids, and this was due to his name being Hamilton Howard Fish. I'm not sure how they got Ham and Eggs from that, but that was his nickname. And following this relentless bullying, that is when Albert decided to permanently change his name to Albert. And this name change was after one of his dead brothers, and this was obviously done to avoid the name-related bullying. Within this orphanage, he was also said to be beaten on a daily basis, and the orphanage workers were said to strip the children naked and beat them in front of all of the other children as a form of shame punishment, which is truly horrible. After some time, though, these beatings were said to have started arousing young Albert, and he began to actually enjoy the physical pain which the beatings caused. And this obviously led to further beatings from the nuns at the orphanage. And it's also said in some sources that the children at the orphanage were encouraged to hurt each other as well. But luckily, Albert was able to leave the orphanage in 1880 at the age of 9, when his mother had secured a job, which allowed her to be more financially stable, and then she could look after her kids again. But it is mentioned throughout his time at the orphanage that Albert didn't gain much of a formal education either. Upon returning home, Albert's mother reported that he often went to bed in the night. This trait is said to be something that is common in young boys who grow up to be serial killers. It's one of the 3 traits which are said to form the McDonald Triad, which is a group of traits which are said to predict whether a child will grow up to commit murder or other serious violent criminal acts. These 3 traits are inuresis, which is involuntary urination, such as wetting the bed past the age of 5. Fire setting, which is an obsession with setting fires, also known as pyromania, as well as a constant cruelty to animals. But this theory has been disputed since its conception in 1963, with some other theories for violent predictions in children coming to light since then. But I'm not going to go into any more detail about these theories today. I just thought that this one was quite interesting, and it's one that I have heard of before as well. At the age of 12 in 1882, Albert actually got into a romantic relationship with another young boy. But this wasn't a typical childhood romantic relationship. This is because the other boy introduced Albert to something called urolagnia and coprophagia. Hopefully I've said that right. I could be completely wrong. And this is where someone drinks urine and eats feces, which is very disturbing and disgusting. During this time, he was also often said to spend his weekends at public baths where he'd watch the other young boys undress, which is a very strange hobby. In 1890, aged 20, Albert relocated to New York, where it said he began his crimes against children, very sadly. He began working as a male sex worker, where he was said to often assault and molest young boys, with most of these victims being said to be younger than 6 years old. He had lured them from their homes and tortured them by beating them using a nail-covered paddle, as well as carrying out assaults. Sadly, I couldn't find much information on the victims of these acts, so I do think this is something that he may have admitted to later in life, maybe when he was arrested, but I'm not 100% sure. I couldn't find any information on that. That is just a speculation from me. In 1989, he was given an arranged marriage by his mother to a woman named Anna Hoffman, who is 9 years younger than him, aged only 20 when he was 29. Within this marriage, they had a total of 6 children together, 2 girls and 4 boys, which you can see in the picture there. That is the children as adults. There's only 3 boys there, but from research I did see 4 boys, but again, that could be wrong. It could have been the 3 that you see. I am not 100% sure. During this time, life for Albert seemed to be improving. He had managed to find a stable, well-paying job as a painter to support his family, but all of this came to an end in 1903 when Albert was arrested for embezzlement and sent to Sing Sing Correctional Facility, which is a maximum security prison in the village of Ossining, hopefully I said that right, which is in New York. Whilst in prison, he was said to have many sexual relationships with the other male inmates. When released from prison, a secret male lover took him to a waxworks museum where he encountered a bisection of a male genitalia, which is the male genitalia cut in half, if you were unaware of that. And this resulted in Albert developing a great interest in male castration. I couldn't find any other information explaining this situation, including any information about the actual lover in question. I wanted to include it just anyway, because it's something that becomes quite important to the case. But yeah, a lot of sources mentioned this, but none of them went into actual great detail about who this guy was or why they went to this museum or anything like that. But I just thought I'd pop it in there anyway. It does become quite important, so keep that in mind. In 1910, Albert was working in Wilmington, Delaware, where he met an intellectually disabled 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden. It's not known whether the relationship was forced by Albert, but they both began partaking in sadomasochistic activities together. After 10 days, Albert took Thomas to an old farmhouse where he proceeded to torture him for 2 whole weeks. And sadly, at the end of this 2 weeks, he tied the poor young man up, cut off half of his male genitalia, and he did state that he originally intended to kill Thomas on that day, but he was worried that it would draw attention to him for some reason. So instead, he poured peroxide, which is a chemical used as an antiseptic, over the wound, wrapped it in a handkerchief covered in Vaseline, gave the boy, or the young man, a $10 bill, and left. And he took the first train he could back to New York. Sadly, I am not sure whether Thomas survived the encounter with Albert. I also read that there are apparently no further records of him at all. So Thomas could have actually been Albert's first murder victim. We don't actually know. Some sources say that he was, but I read that there were actually no further records on this man at all after this, so it can't be proven. In 1917, Albert came home after work to find his house was completely empty, with his children left alone inside. His wife Anna had decided to suddenly leave Albert for a man named John Straub, who was a handyman who had rented a room with the family at one point. Anna had taken all of the furniture in the house, leaving behind the 6 children for Albert to take care of. After his wife left him, Albert was said to begin experiencing auditory hallucinations, with his children coming home to find him wrapped up on the floor in a carpet and encouraging them to eat raw meat with him. His children have since stated that other than the disturbing behaviour caused by his deteriorating mental state, he was a good father and they never experienced any form of abuse from him, claiming that he did the best that he could do to care for the large family on his own. At this point, Albert began to intentionally harm himself, engaging in psychosexual acts of piquerism, I think I said that right, or piquerism, I'm not exactly sure how you say it, which is where he would insert needles into his own abdomen and groin area as a form of sexual pleasure. And this act became so bad for him that at the time of his arrest, X-rays revealed a total of 29 needles left within his pelvic region. He also harmed himself by whipping his own body with a paddle covered in nails, and also setting alight fabric doused in lighter fluid, which he had stuffed into his own rectum. In that picture you can see the paddle which was used by Albert to beat himself. Some of the sources state that in 1919, Albert stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown, but I couldn't find much information on this, so I'm not fully sure whether this actually occurred, and if it did, whether or not the boy survived, but I thought I would just put this in here, just as something to keep in mind, but I'm not 100% sure whether it happened. It only appeared in a few sources. On the 26th of February 1912, Albert was said to get married to a woman named Estella Wilcox. The two were said to separate only a week later, and this was done without any difficulty as their marriage was never actually legal. And this was due to Albert still being legally married to Anna Hoffman, who had left him 7 years earlier. So they were actually still legally married, so he couldn't actually get married to someone else again. I did see some sources saying that he was married for a total of 3 times to some other women, but I couldn't find any information on that, and it was only in a few sources, so I decided to leave that out because it's not super important to the case. So that's something else, just keep in the back of your mind. On the 11th of July 1924, the horrors committed by Albert began to get worse, when he attempted to abduct 8-year-old Beatrice Keel, who was playing alone on her parents' farm in Staten Island, New York. Beatrice was approached by Albert, who offered her money to help him look for rhubarb in a nearby field. Luckily, Beatrice's mother noticed her beginning to walk off with this strange man and ran after them, subsequently chasing Albert away. But Albert actually later returned the same day in order to attempt to sleep in the family's barn. But luckily, once again, Albert was noticed by Beatrice's father and he was chased off the property again. Sadly, just 3 days after the attempted abduction of Beatrice, on the 14th of July 1924, Albert Fish took the life of his first known victim. And this was 8-year-old Francis McDonnell. Francis was playing catch with his friends in his hometown of Port Richmond in Staten Island. An older man called over to the boys and Francis decided to approach him. Francis's friends stated he and the older man then walked off together. When talking with Francis's friends about the man who Francis had left with, his mother stated that she had also seen a man with a similar description earlier that same day, when she was sat on the porch of the family home. She stated that the man was shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself, and had a grey drooping moustache and thick grey hair. And this resulted in Albert actually earning his first nickname, which was the Grey Man. Neighbours also reported that they had seen Francis walking down a nearby grassy road into the forest with an older man. After he was reported missing to the police, it sadly wasn't long until his body was found, and I just want to say, quick trigger warning from this point. The poor young boy was found hanging from a tree with the flesh stripped from one of his legs. It was found that he had sadly experienced SA before being strangled with his own suspenders. Because young Francis was found to have been beaten so badly, police at the time believed that it couldn't have been possible for a frail old man, like witnesses had described, to have caused such injuries to the boy. Albert later claimed that he had originally planned to castrate the boy's remains as well, but he had thought that he heard people approaching, and because of this he quickly fled the scene. Here's a picture of the little boy Francis. It's so sad. It's really sad. 3 years later, on the 11th of February 1927, he claimed the life of a second victim, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. Billy was playing with 2 neighbourhood friends, one of them aged 4 and another aged 12, around the apartment building of where they lived. The older boy had quickly stepped inside for a second, leaving the 2 4-year-old boys outside alone. Upon returning outside, he found both of the boys to be missing. But after some searching, one of the boys was found, and he was hiding on the top floor of the apartment building, and he was stating that the boogeyman had taken his friend Billy. When police came to investigate Billy's disappearance the next day, they actually ignored the explanation from the young boy about what happened to Billy, and police thought that he had just wandered off into some nearby factory buildings or fallen into a nearby canal. And because of this, the canal was searched, but of course no sign of Billy was found there. After having no luck within the search of Billy Gaffney, the police decided to finally listen to the 4-year-old friend that stated Billy was taken by the boogeyman, and he described this man as a tall old man with grey hair and a grey moustache. And at this time, the description that was given was not connected to the case of Francis McDonnell, which is a shame. Because it could have been correct a lot sooner. And in this picture, you can see a picture of little Billy. Poor Billy was put through hell at the hands of the sick and twisted Albert Fish. I'm not going to go into great detail about the acts that Albert committed, as they are absolutely disgusting. After abducting Billy, Albert took him all the way from Brooklyn to the Riker Avenue dumps using public transportation. And I actually looked on Google Maps, and this is said to be approximately a 50-minute car ride using today's method of transportation. So that is it's a long journey. The whole time that they were traveling to this destination, the young boy was said to be crying for his mother and trying to get away from Albert, but absolutely no one interfered with this situation at all. Little Billy could have been saved. He could have been saved, but nobody did anything to help the boy. After getting to the dumps, Albert removed and burned all of Billy's clothes before tying him up and leaving him in the dump until the next day, where he came back to physically abuse the young boy. After committing unimaginable horrors to Billy, he sadly passed away. Albert stated that he then proceeded to drink the blood from the young boy's body, which earned him the name the Brooklyn Vampire. But Albert, of course, didn't end there. He proceeded to dismember the boy, putting some parts into potato sacks and throwing them into some nearby bodies of water. But with the other parts, Albert kept them. He returned home with the remainder of the boy's body and proceeded to cook and cannibalize his remains. He even explained to police after being arrested how he used his body in a recipe and consumed it, which made me feel physically ill. It's so disgusting. He is truly he's just the embodiment of the devil. I have no other words for how to describe this man. He is absolutely horrific. Horrific. Sadly, one more young child would meet Albert before his reign of terror came to an end. Albert contacted the Budd family under the alias Frank Howard after seeing an advertisement in the local newspaper. This advertisement was placed by the 18-year-old son of the Budd family, Edward Budd, on the 25th of May, 1928, stating that he was looking for work in order to try and help his family get out of poverty. This was shortly before the American Great Depression, which would begin in 1929, so a lot of families were beginning to struggle financially at this point. The young man longed to get away from the dirty, crowded city of New York and move to the countryside for a fresh start. So he decided to put his contact information, including his address, in the local newspaper in hopes of being contacted about an opportunity in the countryside, which is something I saw was quite common. I mean, there was no social media, there was no things like that to look for jobs that advertised, so a lot of people put their information in a local newspaper so that employers could come and interview them at their house. It seems like a really strange thing to do nowadays, but that's just how it was. On the 28th of May, an older man turned up to the family home. He introduced himself to Delia Budd, which is the young man's mother, as Frank Howard. So he's going by an alias, like I mentioned before. But of course, it was no other than Albert Fish. He claimed that he was a farmer from Long Island who was here to interview Edward for a job position working on his farm. And here you can see some of the members of the Budd family. I couldn't find a full family picture, which I thought was quite strange, but I guess it was quite expensive to have pictures taken back then. This is just a guess from me. When Delia heard this, she called over her 5-year-old daughter, Beatrice Budd, asking her to go and get her brother, who was at a nearby friend's apartment. Upon seeing the young girl, Albert was said to smile and give her a nickel. Delia later described the man as a kindly-looking old man with grey hair framing his face and a large rupee grey moustache. He told her that he had retired from his job as an interior decorator, purchasing a farm with his life savings, and that was the reason why he was here to speak to her son. When Edward returned with his sister Beatrice, Albert offered him a job, claiming that he would pay him $15 a week, which I did a little bit of research into this, and it's approximately $269 in today's money. But based on the wages of the time, I looked into some old, average wages for each particular job, and for a farm labourer, I found that this wage was above the average monthly wage for a farm contractor with housing included in New York by $12, which back then, obviously, that was the $12 in their money. So it was higher by $12 a month than the average wage. So of course this was an excellent deal. And Edward Budd just couldn't pass that up. It would be ridiculous of him to pass up such a good opportunity. Albert said he would be back in a few days, and he returned on the 3rd of June at around 11 a.m. and he brought gifts of strawberries and cream cheese, stating that they were from his farm, which was, of course, a lie. He stayed with the family for lunch and also got to know the father of the household. And apparently the father was named Albert Budd. So you can see Delia and Albert Budd in that picture there. I don't want it to get confusing. There is 2 Alberts in this case, but I don't think I mentioned the father by name. After this, I apologise if it gets confusing. When sitting for lunch, their other daughter, 10-year-old Grace Budd, joined them. Albert was said to give Grace 50 cents to buy candy for her and her sister Beatrice, before saying that he would come back in the evening to pick up Edward and take him to the farm. He told the family that he had a birthday party to attend for one of his nieces or nephews, asking Grace if she wanted to go to the party with him, which after some persuasion, her parents agreed to let her go. And sadly, this would be the last time they would ever see Grace alive, as she failed to return home after the party. And here is a picture of 10-year-old Grace Budd. 6 years later, the disappearance of Grace Budd was still ongoing, with police being unable to find any strong leads to her whereabouts. After another column in the newspaper about the disappearance, on the 12th of November 1934, the Budd family received a harrowing letter. I'm not going to go into much detail about the letter, as it is really disgusting. The contents of the letter can be found online if you really want to take a look at it, but in short, the letter detailed how the young girl had been abused and cannibalized by the man who visited the Budd household on that day, and of course we now know that to be Albert Fish. It detailed things that only the man would have known, and of course because of this, the family knew that it just wasn't a hoax. So here in this picture on screen, you can see the actual missing persons poster, which was used after Grace had gone missing. This is the letter as well. I only included this letter because I found it was very hard to read. But if you do want to see the full transcript, you can find it online. So once the evidence of the letter was given to the police, they noticed that the envelope had a hexagonal emblem on it, which belonged to a chauffeurs association in New York. Police conducted a handwriting test for all of the members, but none of them matched the writing found in the letter, leading them to believe the stationery must have been stolen. Someone did actually come forwards, who was a janitor, stating that he had taken some stationery to use at his shared accommodation. When the description of the old man was provided to tenants of the house, the landlady stated that it fit the exact description of an elderly man who had moved out of the property just a couple of days earlier. And this man had the name Albert H. Fish. 1 month later, on the 13th of December 1934, the landlady contacted the police, claiming that Albert Fish had returned, looking for a letter which had been posted to his old address from his son. Albert had finally been caught, but this wasn't without a fight. And some sources stated that Albert took a razor blade out of his pocket and threatened police with it when they tried to arrest him. But luckily, this was the end of his reign of terror. He was finally caught. And he was only caught because he couldn't help but pretty much give himself up. That is the only way he was caught. He wrote a letter, and that's the only reason he was caught for this, which is scary. If he hadn't wrote that letter, maybe he would have never been caught. The details of Albert's horrors absolutely shocked the New York area. When the heavily edited details were revealed to the press, people were extremely shocked at how such a frail, harmless-looking old man could be the person behind such awful acts. Albert was described as being only 5 foot 5 inches or 165 centimeters and weighing 130 pounds or 59 kilograms. He confessed to police that he had originally intended to kill Edward, Grace's 18-year-old brother, when he saw the advertisement, but was absolutely enthralled by 10-year-old Grace when he laid eyes on her, which is apparently what he said. He told them how he had strangled her to death before draining her blood into a bucket, cutting her up, saving parts of her body, which he then cooked and consumed. The rest of her remains, he stated, he threw over a stone wall, which is where she sadly remained until after Albert's confession, when police went to collect her now skeletonized body. When interviewed further, Albert was said to break down into tears, claiming that he was overcome with bloodthirst at the time and would give up his life if he could restore hers, which I think is absolute BS. Absolute BS. It makes me so mad. When I read that, it made me so mad. Like, genuinely mad, to the point where I had to leave my PC for a little bit during my research, because how dare he say something like that? That is, screw you. That he would give up his life if he could restore it. Yeah, right. Why would you even do that in the first place then? He later confessed to the other murders of 8-year-old Francis McDonnell and 4-year-old Billy Gaffney, with several witnesses coming forward to identify him, including the father of the then 8-year-old Beatrice Keel, who Albert had attempted to kidnap just days prior to the murder of Francis McDonnell. And if you remember, he was chased off their farm as well. Before Albert's trial for the murder of Grace Budd, a medical examination found that Albert had inserted 29 needles into his groin area for some sort of sadistic pleasure, which I did mention earlier. And some of the needles were said to have been in his body for so long that they had actually begun to rust and degrade inside his body. He claimed that he had originally only inserted the needles and then pulled them out again, but after some time he had begun inserting them so far into his skin that he just couldn't retrieve them anymore, so he just left them there. Albert had also begun to claim that from the age of 55, he had started to experience delusions and hallucinations, claiming that God had ordered him to torment and castrate young boys. Eye roll. Albert's defense lawyer believed that Albert was legally insane, claiming that he was suffering from what he called paranoid psychosis. And this is actually an x-ray that was conducted, and you can see all of the little needles that are on that x-ray. It makes my skin crawl. It really makes my skin crawl. But on the 11th of March 1935, when the trial for the murder of Grace Budd began, prosecution successfully argued that Albert was to be considered as fully sane. The trial was honestly really crazy from what I read into it, and the defense attorney was said to actually bring Grace's remains into the courtroom, and they held up her skull in front of everyone during the trial, which is something I have never heard of being done before. I have no words for that, actually. Like, who thought that was a good idea? To bring this poor girl's remains into trial to show everybody. And just hold up like some sort of... I don't even know. It's just disgusting. They held up this poor girl's skull in the middle of his court trial. And of course, in that image, as you can see, that's Albert getting led to his court trial, covering his face for some reason. Overall, the trial lasted for 10 days, and the jury deliberated for less than 1 hour to reach their final verdict. They stated that they found Albert guilty for the murder of Grace Budd, and he was sentenced to death via electrocution. He was never taken to trial for the murder of Francis McDonald or Billy Gaffney, and this was because there was insufficient evidence for him doing this to them. The fact that he faced no further trials didn't really matter, because less than 1 year later, on the 16th of January 1936 at 11:06 p.m, Albert met his end with the electric chair and was pronounced dead at 11:09 p.m. at Sing Sing Prison in New York, and at this time he was aged 66. But it's said that Albert actually was looking forward to his death and even helped the guards attach the electrodes to his body when he was in the chair. The fact that he was looking forward to it gives me very conflicting opinions, because if he was looking forward to it, then it's not a punishment for what he did. Like, did he really get punished? And did the other little boys actually get any justice? Like, most of people that I have read about are on death row for a lot of years. They suffer in prison for a lot of years. And I am sure with his crimes against children, he would have not had a very good time in prison. But he seemed really to get away with it pretty easy. And the fact that it said that he was even looking forward to it makes you think, really? Was there actually any justice for these victims? I don't know. In a way, it's not using taxpayers' money, yada yada, you know, that all that argument with it. But at the same time, he was into that stuff. He was looking forward to that. Like, I don't know. I have very conflicting opinions, and I'm not sure what to actually kind of make of it altogether. That's why I'm very on the fence about the death penalty for criminals, because of course I feel like you should be punished for things, you know, if you take a life, whatever, you take a life, you give, you know, your life, that kind of thing. I completely agree with that. But at the same time, part of me thinks, is it an easy way out? Would it be more torturous for them to go through years and years in prison? But then again, on the same note as that, that's a lot of taxpayers' money to go into these criminals that don't deserve anything. It's just, it's a very difficult topic of debate. It's a very difficult topic. And that's why there's such a huge debate around it. I can't really reach a conclusion as to whether justice was actually served in this case, especially seeing as the other two boys didn't get to go to trial. Their case didn't get to go to trial. He didn't get to, you know, like, go through that. But then at the same time, if he was sentenced to death anyway, was there any point of going to trial? Especially seeing as they said that they didn't have enough evidence to take him to trial on those, because it was just what he said. I don't know. It's difficult. I guess if it was in today's time, they could have had the evidence to do it. There would have been DNA, there would have been fingerprints, all of that. But back then, there was no fingerprints. There was no DNA. I just want to say a very big thank you for taking the time to watch my content today. I really hope that you learned something new today as well. If you are enjoying this style of content, please remember to like the video, subscribe to my YouTube, and leave a comment down below with any suggestions at all. I would love to hear what you have to say. And if you haven't already, please go check out my Twitch too. I stream on there several times a week, as well as record the true crime content live with you guys. So if you want to be one of the first to check out the next case, I would definitely recommend heading over to my Twitch. You can find the link on screen now or down below in the description box. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Remember to be kind to others, and I will hopefully see you all next time. Goodbye!